How are you today? Good? Have you been reading the history of the Peloponnesian War? Yeah? It's a beautiful day. It's a good day for a beautiful book. Okay? Okay, so this week, I think according to your schedule, this week and next you'll be reading and discussing the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. This book is important for understanding the ancient Greek world, but I think perhaps more importantly for the purposes of the Civilization Studies program, it provides insight into how we understand the world we live in, insight into the human condition, and insight into the standards we hold as ideals. So it has a lot to say about our own existence and our own world, and not just the ancient Greek world. Of course, all our readings in Civilization Studies do this. However, with Thucydides, and this is something that you should note as you do the readings and as you're in class discussing this work, with Thucydides, we start to see that the Greeks are looking at the world in a different way. Okay? Thucydides is looking at the world in a different way, in contrast to those views that you've had prior to this moment in this semester. Okay? So, for example, Homer. Think about the kind of perspective that Thucydides offers in contrast to that of someone like Homer. So who was Thucydides? First of all, he was an Athenian who lived in the 5th century BC. His history of the Peloponnesian War recounts a war between Athens and Sparta that occurred during his lifetime. On one level, the purpose of the history was to explain what happened. Okay? So people who want to know what happened and when it happened, who won, who lost, et cetera, who the victor was, who the victims were, or if you just like to be entertained by reading history, which some people like to do, you can get what you want from the book. But many historians examine the past to uncover something deeper, a deeper kind of reality, forces and circumstances that shaped particular events. So the question is then, what is Thucydides telling us in this history? This is what I want to try to grapple with today, okay? He states very, very bluntly, "My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever." This is quite a claim. How can an account of a war that occurred 2,500 years ago possibly have any relevance for today, much less forever? Okay? The work was not designed for an immediate public, but it was designed for the Civilization Studies program. Okay? And your job is to figure out what it can offer you. Most of what we know about Thucydides comes from his book. It's not much, actually. He refers to himself in the first line. Thucydides, the Athenian, wrote the history of the war between Athens and Sparta. Okay, this is pretty typical. The author identifies himself immediately because there's no such thing as a title page. He lived in Athens in the 5th century BC, but he was not an ordinary Athenian. He was wealthy. His family owned gold mines in northern Greece. So there's Athens and Sparta, northern Greece. He tells us that during the war he served as a general in the Athenian army. He was only 35 years old at the time. He also mentions that he was a general, that when he was a general, he was ordered to defend the city of Amphipolis in Thrace in northern Greece. The city was valuable for its strategic location and obviously for its wealth, of course, his family's gold mines. But his expedition, his military expedition, failed to arrive in time to defend the city against the enemies of the Athenians, the Spartans. Consequently, the Athenian assembly punished him. He was dismissed from his command and sentenced to exile from Athens until the end of the war. This was a fairly typical exile from the polis, from the city, was a fairly typical punishment at this time. And I think you'll encounter other such incidents in the weeks ahead. He took the opportunity of his forced retirement to research and write his history of the Peloponnesian War. He traveled extensively to interview participants in the conflict and to visit various theaters of the war in Greece and perhaps as far away as Syracuse on the island of Sicily, where the outcome of the war was decided. He died in the year 400, before he could finish writing book 8 of his work, in the middle of his narrative of the year 411. So he still had 6.5 years of the history that he was unable to recount. So in order to understand Thucydides' book, and you know how big it is, okay, and you're just reading a fraction of that. So what I want to try to do today is to talk about what the whole book can offer you through that kind of very kind of slender selection of readings that have been assigned. In order to understand his book, it is helpful to consider his intellectual background first. Not much is known. He was a military officer, you already know that. In his history, he says he admires a man named Antiphon, who is a sophist and a politician. Other sources suggest that he studied with a man named Protagoras, who was also a sophist. Sophism, very briefly, was a prominent intellectual movement in 5th century Greece known for the use of rhetoric and argumentation. Okay? Rhetoric in the use of argumentation. So, for example, one of its proponents claimed that he could make the weaker argument the stronger, simply by fashioning his argument in the right way, not really dependent on any kind of substance or evidence. Thucydides, however, seems not to have been interested in the usual benefits of sophism, which Plato, who's coming up, right, in the syllabus, later associated with the political ambitions of well-to-do young men in Athens. However, some see the influence of sophism in Thucydides' rhetorical techniques in the book that you are reading. Okay? For example, in his presentation of antithetical elements, the cities of Sparta and Athens, the politicians Pericles and Cleon. Okay? So he's contrasting these cities and these men. Why does he do this? This is something to talk about in class and to think about as you read the text. He also reports two sides of political disputes, for example, in a section of the book in your reading assignment called The Debate at Sparta, which is a series of speeches given at the outset of the war. In these speeches, you, as the reader, can examine directly the conflicting arguments and points of view. Okay? So, perhaps Thucydides is telling us that this is how we should try to understand the world, from different points of view. Perhaps. Think about that. Thucydides also uses this technique of oppositions in his narrative style. Take the funeral oration of Pericles, which is another section of your reading assignment. Pericles was a great Athenian statesman and an advocate of democracy who in the text gives a very eloquent speech on the virtues of Athens. The speech, full of noble ideals, stands in stark contrast to the absence of ideals in the reality of the plague epidemic that later ravaged the city and that follows the funeral oration. In the funeral oration, Pericles declaims to the Athenians, and I'll be quoting here, and a lot of the quotes I actually have on the screen, okay? But some of them are actually just in the fly sheet, okay? But they're all in order at the end of the outline. So in the funeral oration, Pericles states, "What I would prefer is that you should fix your eyes every day on the greatness of Athens as she really is, and should fall in love with her. When you realize her greatness, then reflect that what made her great was men who were ashamed to fall below a certain standard. The standard of Athens is based on the lawfulness of Athens and Athenians." Pericles continues, "We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep to the law. This is because it commands our deep respect. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the laws themselves, especially those which are the protection of the oppressed, and those unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break." He seems to be telling us here that our behavior in society should be guided by laws. Yeah? Pretty obvious. But written laws are not enough. There are still unwritten laws. What could they be? Maybe the expectations of personal virtue, of moral behavior, okay, that we need to follow also, in addition to those written laws that society enacts for itself. Then Thucydides moves on to talking about the plague epidemic in the text. Again, to go back to this issue of oppositions. Those unwritten laws appear to be very fragile. In Thucydides' eyewitness account of the plague, he says, in other respects also, Athens owed to the plague the beginnings of a state of unprecedented lawlessness. As for what is called honor, no one showed himself willing to abide by its laws. The law of honor, which is an unwritten law. No one showed himself willing to abide by its laws, so doubtful was it whether we would survive to enjoy the name of it. It was generally agreed that what was both honorable and valuable was the pleasure of the moment and everything that might conceivably contribute to that pleasure. No fear of God or law of man had a restraining influence. So he contrasts the greatness of Athenian law, on the one hand, law and virtue, with the appearance of lawlessness in the plague. What's he doing here? Is he attacking Athens? Is he attacking its laws? Is he attacking Pericles? Was he simply being cynical? Okay. Think about this. Thucydides' understanding of both Pericles and the plague demonstrates his ability to see perhaps a kind of deeper reality within his history, below the surface, so to speak. The tensions underlying civic virtue and the fragility, perhaps, of human character. So, whatever his background, Thucydides really had quite a remarkable ability, I think, to observe the connections between the individual and the world the Greeks lived in. To sum up this first part of the talk, the author of the history of the Peloponnesian War was an Athenian. He served as a general in the Athenian army. He was removed for command for failure in that war and punished. He wrote a history of the war that he fought in. So, you might expect him to write a rather biased account of the history, yeah, given his involvement. One that favors one side over the other. This is something to think about as you read the text and discuss it. Moreover, he claims that his history will be of relevance for all time. So, if his method of history might be matched, his confidence would certainly be very difficult to beat. This brings up the question, is Thucydides' confidence born of hubris? Okay, another important word that we get from the ancient Greeks. For Thucydides, history meant a systematic inquiry into contemporary events. So you can think of the title as not the history of the Peloponnesian War, especially if you think history is boring. Think about it as the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War. He had very little patience for the interest of his predecessors, like Herodotus, who showed in the romantic element of the stories they recorded. His criticism of Herodotus and others is indirect. He doesn't mention their names. He's very polite in that fashion. But it is certainly clear that he considered the historical method used by them, and what I mean by the historical method in this context is simply their view of the past and how they use information from the past. He believed that their view of the past was entirely inadequate. He remarks, okay, the rest of the Hellenes, too, make many incorrect assumptions not only about the dimly remembered past, but also about contemporary history. Most people, in fact, will not take trouble in finding out the truth, but are much more inclined to accept the first story they hear. Okay? How many of us are perhaps sometimes guilty of that? All right? We tend to kind of accept information based on friendship, familiarity of the source. Okay? Do either of those things have anything to do with accuracy? Thucydides concerned himself only with contemporary events, and his approach to doing history rested on the conviction that little can be known of the distant past. However, in spite of that conviction, remember, 2,500 years later, I would argue that his historical method, his principles, his ability to distinguish significant things from perhaps less significant things proves for us today that much can be learned from any past, no matter how distant. So we need to talk a little bit about his historical method. What was it? First of all, he avoided discussion of myths and gods. Okay? The supernatural in any form had no role to play in anything he wrote about. So think about how that attitude or approach is different from what you've been reading up until this time. Politics and society were subjects to be examined with skepticism. He states that all evidence should be tested for accuracy. He says, this is on the fly sheet, and with regard to my factual reporting of the events of the war, I have made it a principle not to write down the first story that came my way, and not even to be guided by my own general impressions. Either I was present myself at the events which I have described, or else I heard of them from eyewitnesses whose reports I've checked with as much thoroughness as possible. He says that the accuracy of the evidence was further enhanced by his development of a chronological scheme in which to incorporate his data. There was no standard calendar in ancient Greece, okay? So he had to devise a system, a kind of a calendar for keeping track of time. He measured time from the first year of the war, and each year was divided into summer and winter seasons, okay? Appropriate perhaps for Greece, appropriate perhaps also for Lebanon. Thus, his array of verified information, placed within the proper context, chronological context, allowed for the effective interpretation of the historical evidence. What happens then? Then you can start to maybe discriminate between primary causes, which can be distinguished from secondary causes. Political and military events sometimes take on a more superficial quality if there are maybe deeper forces and circumstances that are at play, as if they were symptoms of what? A kind of a disease, as when a doctor examines a patient, right? You can't really tell, you can't know for sure what's wrong except by looking for clues. Much is made of Thucydides' method, but remember that his method was also tempered by his particular view. When he talks about, and he uses these phrases, reasonable accuracy and truest causes, we're reminded that we're reading his interpretation of the war, just as we read his interpretation of the speeches that he reports to us in such detail. Okay? No one was recording these speeches. That's obvious. And he says very candidly, I found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. So my method has been, while keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speeches say what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation. The historian Herodotus, his predecessor, by not too many years, recreated the atmosphere of the past. Herodotus is the historian that Thucydides criticized, of course. For Thucydides, recreating the past was not enough, however. Thucydides' historical method forms a narrative that contains arguments, interpretation, founded on the belief that our knowledge of the past is useful because we can understand it from all sides, or as many points of view as possible. We can see the difference between the profound and the superficial. His intellectual acuity may have been sharpened by sophistic training, okay? But our reading between the lines, we get the sense that his historical method was guided also by moral convictions that ran as deep as those realities he was trying to bring to the surface for us. By means of understanding history, Thucydides believed we could make better political judgments. And this will be coming up, I think, in your readings in the future. Aren't political judgments really moral judgments? And at least understand, if not entirely avoid, such tragedies as the war between Athens and Sparta. So perhaps it does have some relevance for our modern world. So, what does the book consist of? As I said before, it's a big book, okay? So again, I want to try to distill. I'm kind of distilling it. Doesn't mean you can get away with not reading it, though. Keep that in mind. When we see the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War as an account of the past that includes interpretations and convictions, it becomes clear that the book contains a whole series of arguments. One might consider it, for example, a treatise on historiography. What's historiography? It's the method of doing history, okay? He argues, for example, that his evidence is more reliable than that of the poets, like maybe Homer, who exaggerate the importance of their themes, or of the prose chroniclers, perhaps like Herodotus, who are less interested in telling the truth than in catching the attention of their public, whose authorities cannot be checked. This method formed the foundation for additional arguments, okay? A historical argument, for example. In the past, the Persian War had been considered the greatest war. This is actually a claim that Herodotus made. But Thucydides argued that the war between Athens and Sparta was the greatest war of all time. Okay, as he expresses it, more worth writing about than any of those which had taken place in the past. his reasons for this claim. It lasted such a long time, 27 years. He says, "Never before had so many cities been captured and then devastated, whether by foreign armies or by the Hellenic powers themselves. Never had there been so many exiles, never such loss of life, both in the actual warfare and in internal revolutions. The destruction wrought by humanity was followed by upheaval in the natural world. Wide areas, for example, were affected by violent earthquakes, eclipses, drought, famine, plague. All these calamities fell together upon the Hellenes after the outbreak of the Great War." Okay? So we have a historiographical argument about his method, a historical argument. What might be next? How about a political argument? Okay? He argues that the power and greatness of Athens was a result of its development of navigation and commerce, put very simply. The Athenian navy enabled the city to accumulate wealth, and this was the foundation of its empire. On the more immediate causes of the war, Thucydides reported the complaints of the two sides against each other, that is, the Athenians and the Spartans, and the clash of their respective interests. But those superficial causes obscured the real reason for the war. What could that be? Imperial ambition, perhaps? Thucydides argues that what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. His historical argument has an even wider reach, in part because of his method, which I already mentioned, but also more significantly, as with many thinkers of the era, the broad scope of his vision rested on the conviction that moral issues and conflicts were an integral element in politics. Thus, the history of the Peloponnesian War is not strictly a story of the conflict between Athens and Sparta. The story is actually deeper. Okay? You have to look for this when you're reading it. It's the story of moral conflict, experienced perhaps by human character, or the story of the strengths and weaknesses of individuals and societies to understand forces that are usually difficult to comprehend entirely, to comprehend from all sides. Just as Athenian democracy failed to comprehend the implications of imperial ambition. I think there's lots of parallels in the modern world about this, yeah? Perhaps for this reason, some have claimed, on the basis of ancient readers of Thucydides, Thucydides never said this himself, but his ancient readers claimed this, that history is philosophy teaching by example. This wider understanding underlies his entire effort. It will be enough for me, he states, if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the events which happened in the past and which, human nature being what it is, okay, what does that mean? Will at some time or other, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future. It's probably from this that we get the whole line about history repeats itself, yeah? A better line is, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. The principles of his method and his vision of Hellenic history enable a deeper understanding of human affairs. According to Thucydides, human nature, being what it is, makes such an understanding absolutely imperative, and implicitly, human nature also makes understanding possible. If his main thesis deals with an inquiry into imperial ambition, and his approach to history is founded on moral convictions, how do these elements relate to each other? One way to answer this question is to start by untangling the various strands of the conflict. And this is where it gets a little bit difficult, okay? Because you have a mass of details. So again, I'm going to try to untangle them for you. At the time of the Peloponnesian War, Greece wasn't unified, okay? It consisted of city-states and villages, which you probably know a lot about. The inhabitants of these places spoke dialects of Greek, and they all shared a common heritage in religion and poetry. Okay, so they worshiped the same gods, they're reading the same poets. These various small states shared a distinct sense that they were Greek, okay, and different from everyone else, whose essential characteristic from the Greek point of view was that they were simply foreigners or barbarians. In spite of this common identity, though, Thucydides informs us that there existed a variety of differences between the Greek city-states, and in particular, there were fundamental differences in culture, economics, politics, etc., that separated Athens and Sparta. There they are again. Okay, now in an effort to try to untangle these various strands of the conflict, I've put in tabular form a lot of these issues that I'm talking about so far, okay, to kind of help you follow. The inhabitants of Athens and Sparta spoke two different dialects. of Greek. The Athenians were Ionians, whose customs and traditions were different from those of the Spartans, who were Dorians. Although such differences are often superficial, the cultural divide between the two ran much deeper. Just as Sparta was landlocked in the middle of the Peloponnesus, that is the big peninsula, the big island-shaped thing at the end of the Greek peninsula, Sparta was landlocked there. It also isolated itself from cultural change. The Spartan educational system helped them field the most disciplined and effective army in the Hellenic world, and it also helped them resist the new intellectual attitudes like those of the sophists, like the approaches of people like Plato that were sweeping over 5th century Greece, or the plays of Sophocles. These are all in your syllabus. Athens, on the other hand, was receptive to all sorts of innovation and was open to Greece's intellectual and artistic revolution. The speeches and the debate at Sparta, that is one section of your readings, suggest to us that the gulf was so deep between them that conflict was practically inevitable. The speech of the Corinthians, and so the Corinthians are in between the two, literally, all right, talking about both sides, the Athenians and the Spartans. An Athenian is always an innovator, quick to form a resolution and quick at carrying it out. You Spartans, on the other hand, are good at keeping things as they are. You never originate an idea, and your action tends to stop short of its aim. So the Athenians, on the one hand, are too quick. The Spartans, on the other hand, are too cautious. The war between Athens and Sparta was as much a conflict, one might conclude then, was as much a conflict of cultures as it was a war of politics. Okay? And you can kind of examine this by comparing the maps. Political alliances versus the difference between Ionian and Dorian. Another major difference between Athens and Sparta concerned their economic circumstances. The Spartans, in the middle of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, were self-sufficient in food. Consequently, the city was rich in natural resources but poor in money. Athens, in contrast, had too little farmland to support its population, and it relied extensively on seaborne commerce to supply its needs in food and timber. You need timber to build ships, right? To build a navy, to extend your empire. Aside from its mineral wealth, Athens was a thriving commercial center, so it had access to a steady income, and it was further enriched by money collected from the members of the alliance it led. It was this wealth that enabled Athens to build the Parthenon and other monumental buildings that the city is so well known for. We often take, of course, these buildings to represent Athenian democracy, which is fair. But I think we should also perhaps see them as representing Athenian empire. The political constitutions of these two states were radically different as well. And again, you could look at the table. Sparta possessed a form of government, very, very stable, one might say conservative, that combined elements of monarchy and aristocracy. Sparta's agricultural domain was worked by a conquered people called the Helots, who outnumbered the Spartans and who were liable to rebel if Sparta showed any signs of weakness. To prevent this from happening, the Spartans relied on their stable government and rigid educational system to build a powerful land-based military. So the Spartans have a strong army, the Athenians have a strong navy. In contrast to the Spartan form of government, the Athenians, after more than a century of political upheaval, had established a democracy. The citizens of Athens, a category, of course, that did not include women and slaves, so you can argue about how democratic is that, right? But the citizens, those who were deemed to be citizens, could participate equally in the public affairs of Athens. Okay, that's saying something. In the view of Thucydides, who was not a proponent of radical democracy, the proper functioning of Athenian democracy depended on the quality of its leading citizens. This is where virtue and character enter the picture. For example, he says of Pericles, because of his position, intelligence, and his known integrity, Pericles could respect the liberty of the people and at the same time hold them in check. So in what was nominally a democracy, power was really in the hands of the first citizen. But the collective citizenry could vote, and thus the city's policy could quickly change to suit the mood of the public, okay? Because an effective speaker, or let's say an effective rhetorician on Twitter, could communicate effectively and sway the assembly, men who lacked virtue used their influence to manipulate the citizens of Athens. For Thucydides, Cleon was perhaps the most notorious of these demagogues. Try to find a picture on the internet. I think it'll be tough to, but if you find one, let me know. A demagogue is one who would exploit popular prejudices or passion for his own political gain, for the violence of his character. That's a quote from Thucydides, the violence of his character, and his influence over the citizens of Athens. It was the powerful influence of demagogues like Cleon that made the political life of a democracy like Athens so precarious. Thucydides' opposition of these two individuals, Pericles and Cleon, men of virtue versus men without, gives us a hint that he was arguing that goodness and virtue may have been the real victim of the war. So, these various features, cultural, economic, political, shaped the two cities' respective imperial policies. While Sparta oppressed a subject population at home, the various states within its Peloponnesian League could act with considerable independence. The League's political and military decisions tended to be slow. Remember, the Spartans are cautious, okay? Since the member states of the League required time to consult. Athens, in contrast, as head of the Delian League, was ruthless and characteristically quick to lord it over its so-called allies, to the extent that Athenian democracy counted for nothing beyond its walls. Athenian imperial ambition grew out of its powerful political position at the end of the preceding war with Persia. Remember, the war that Herodotus claimed was the greatest war. The growth of Athenian power, Thucydides argued, endangered Sparta's political security. It increased their fear. The gradual realization of Athenian imperial ambitions upset the balance of power between the two. The pressures built to such a degree that diplomatic maneuvering against weaker neutral states triggered the armed conflict between the two powers. Thucydides shows that in an imperial world, the political neutrality of cities such as Melos, described in the Melian dialogue, could be as fragile as Athenian democracy and was simply a prelude to their destruction. In this respect, Thucydides was realistic in his depiction, but I think we have to be careful and recognize also that this recognition should not obscure his ideals. So, how can we penetrate this mass of arguments and historical data? It's a complex book, I keep saying, okay? So I'm still trying to distill it a little bit for you. I've noted on the fly sheet there are 3 phases to the war, okay? And there's no sense really to get into the history here, but I just want to kind of encapsulate it very briefly. It's more effective, I think, to try to not to understand the history, but rather to focus on the themes, which I've already been alluding to. Themes like empire and ambition, justice and noble purpose, virtue, human character, understanding, how we can understand. We know that this is a story of a war between Athens and Sparta, but what was at the center of the conflict? Thucydides mourns the general deterioration of character throughout the Greek world, what he calls the simple way of looking at things. What does he mean by this? Perhaps that political ambition can distort the way we see things, or distort the way people are, or imperial ambition can lead to moral collapse. Within 3 years of the start of the conflict, Athens' allies rebelled as Mytilene did. So we can kind of look at some of these incidents which have been included in your reading selection and extract maybe some of these themes. So Mytilene rebels. Where's Mytilene? There it is. Okay, you can go to Mytilene and have a beach holiday. This is where the rebellion occurred. This was a matter of grave concern to the Athenians, since the Mytileneans had a large fleet too valuable to the Athenians to lose. The issue of how to resolve the Mytilenean problem was debated by the Athenians in a section called appropriately the Mytilenean debate. Some Athenians, led by Cleon, felt compelled to make an example of Mytilene by killing all of its male citizens and enslaving its women and children, which in fact was a fairly common practice in the ancient world, in the ancient Greek world, and the ancient world more generally. Cleon argued, punish them as they deserve and make an example of them to your other allies, plainly showing that revolt will be punished by death. The central issue of the debate, though, is not whether to spare the Mytileneans or not. There's nothing about human rights, okay? The central issue of the debate is what is best for Athens. Pericles had foreshadowed the moral blindness that would afflict Athens when he said, "Your Athenian empire is like a tyranny. It may have been wrong to take it, but it is certainly dangerous to let it go." And in the debate, Cleon the demagogue echoes him. If the Mytileneans were justified in revolting, then you Athenians must be wrong in holding power. The point here, the virtuous ruler and the demagogue, in this imperial context, start to sound frightfully similar. The moral foundation of noble character seems to be destroyed by the demands of empire. The moral collapse of Athenian politics foreshadowed the moral collapse of Greek society more generally, which is first observed in Corcyra, the civil war in Corcyra. Fathers killed their sons. Men were dragged from the temples or butchered on the very altars. Some were actually walled up in the temple of Dionysus and died there. The bonds of family were desecrated, as were all the other elements of social life, even language. Language is the one thing that ties our society together, right? To fit in with the change of events, words, too, had to change their usual meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a political party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. The ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. Perhaps Thucydides was referring to himself there, okay, in his own failed military action. After the death of Pericles, 2.5 years after the start of the war, the state of Athens deteriorated even more. Thucydides relates that Pericles' successors lacked his foresight and character. They adopted methods of demagogy which resulted in their losing control over the actual conduct of affairs. Not only did they lose control over political affairs, but they ultimately lost the basis of their empire. Private ambition and profit led to policies which were bad both for the Athenians themselves and for their allies. Okay. So, with the loss of character, it is too easy to adopt the principle that might makes right, okay, as at Melos and as at Syracuse at the end of the war. There's quotes that kind of relate to this in the fly sheet, okay? At the end of the war, as Thucydides says, the Athenians were on the verge of being enslaved themselves, okay? No Hellenic army had ever suffered such a reverse. The Athenians had come to enslave others, and now they were going away frightened of being enslaved themselves. Okay. What are we to learn from Thucydides' history? What lessons might it teach us so that, in his words, his work would last forever? Okay? The history of the Peloponnesian War has as many lessons, I think, as it has arguments, perhaps even more lessons. But clearly, Thucydides' history, which was built on the solid foundation of his method, his convictions about character, and shaped by his vision of history, his vision of humanity, has more to teach us, I think, than the story of the dissolution of an empire. Okay? Thucydides speaks of standards of character. And so while Athens and Sparta were the chief opponents in the Peloponnesian War, I think in many respects the protagonists of his history are Athens and Thucydides, excuse me. Pericles' funeral oration praised Athens as a lesson for Greece. The irony of this praise in the larger context of Thucydides' history is revealing. Athens was a lesson for us, absolutely, but not only in an admirable way. Consider what lesson Athens almost taught at Mytilene, and what lesson it did teach at Melos, or what her army demonstrated outside Syracuse. Don't follow the example of Athens. Human nature, to use his definition, which I don't find particularly helpful, being what it is, and the fragile role of the noble character in human affairs makes the lesson of political ambition one that will be relevant forever. As for Thucydides, with his ability to understand a question from all sides, and does he have that ability? Something to think about. He does seem to have a pretty sharp eye for pretense, though. He could distinguish the profound from the shallow. He penetrated the surface of his era's moral system and exposed the fragility of human goodness. Athens lost the war, and political ambition claimed a lot of victims. But perhaps the real victim was noble character, the simple way of looking at things. Time and again in the history, he shows us that justice is honored more in speech than in action, and more by the weak than by the powerful. But that doesn't necessarily make it right. By following his standards of thoughtful judgment and character, perhaps we too can sharpen our own vision of humanity and achieve something in the study and practice of virtue. So, it's a beautiful day. I encourage you to go outside and study and practice virtue. Thank you very much.